It was great to hear from you, great to hear your path. So our next speaker is Ms. Faria Ahmed. She's a clinical research assistant in the COVID-19 dental school study at McGill University. She received a Bachelor's of Science in Registered Nursing and a Master's degree in Microbiology and Immunology, both from the University of Ottawa. So give her a big welcome.
Hi, sorry, I'm trying to get to the podium. Am I at the right spot?
Yes, I think Susanna's still standing on it. I think that might be the issue. Thank you, Susanna, for so yeah, right there, perfect.
Okay, awesome. I'll get started on sharing my screen. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so thank you everyone for having me here today. My name is Faria and I'm a clinical research assistant at McGill's Faculty of Dentistry. So super excited to be here and to see the last few talks, which were all very like unconventional routes in scientific research, and everyone's like branched out differently. So my talk is going to be similar in that way. So I'll be talking to you about more or less the field of transdisciplinary clinical research and my personal research experiences on interdisciplinary COVID-19 projects. So a little bit about my academic background. I did my Bachelor's of Sciences in Biochemistry, Biotechnology, and my Master's in Microbiology, Immunology, both like very basic sciences kind of fields. And then I went and I did something very unconventional, which is I did my Bachelor's of Sciences in Nursing, which is just wrapping up. And then I'm hoping to specialize in critical care nursing, which looks more like working in ICU, critical care settings, or NICUs. So in today's talk, I want to focus a little bit about what we understand by basic science, clinical science, where kind of they overlap, a little bit about my clinical and academic training, and then some of the projects that I've worked on COVID-19. And lastly, I'll give you some kind of insight about how you can combine your basic sciences background and your clinical research interests for a career. Okay, so let's start with understanding basic sciences. So I'm guessing most of you are doing your grad school in microbiology and immunology, which means you're primarily working in a laboratory setting or a wet lab setting. And this usually looks like a lot of in vitro experimentation. Some labs work with animal models, and then there's labs which work with human subjects. And that can look like a couple of different ways. So you might be getting like tissue samples or other biological samples from human subjects, or you might be preparing biological agents to be then tested in human subjects, like maybe oncolytic viruses, vaccines, and other therapeutics. So whenever you're working with human subjects, a basic scientist usually has to partner with like a clinician, whether it's like an MD or a nurse practitioner or clinical researchers at hospitals, and it can happen across a variety of settings. So clinical research is very broad and basically can mean a lot of different things, including scientific research and social science research. The most common ones we think of are like doing drug trials, where you're testing out different like pharmacotherapies, immunotherapies. You can do like various interventions, whether it's like a surgical intervention, but it can also be less invasive and might look like a longitudinal, over a period of time, you're kind of observing your cohort and seeing what's changing in that population, or you're just dealing with like health data in a retrospective manner. So you're looking back at patient files maybe over a 10-year period and kind of trying to see what kind of healthcare treatments were like giving out poor outcomes and how those can be changed. So this is where my interest lies in research. So I was in basic sciences and I wasn't super happy to be just working in a lab. I wanted to kind of work where different disciplines came and met each other and talked to each other for like real world change. So it's kind of like at the intersection of basic science and technology, clinical research, and other fields like health policy, health economics, knowledge translation. Kind of in the middle of everything is what we call like transdisciplinary clinical research. I'm sure you've heard of the terms from bench to bedside, and that is a classic example of when we take something that's maybe from a basic science lab and it's a finding, we test it out in a clinical population, and then we test it for implementation in the real world. So a little bit about my background and training. So I did my basic sciences training, as I told you, and while I was doing that, I was funded by the Canadian Network on Hepatitis C And that's when I first actually saw like transdisciplinary research teams working together. In particular, like I observed like health economists working with basic scientists and clinicians. And that was very interesting to me. So that's what first piqued my interest. So after doing like my clinical training in nursing in various different specialties, when I was working on my research projects over the last few years, I found the opportunity to work on one of these kind of transdisciplinary research projects, particularly in surgical clinical trials. And during that time, I was getting funded by the Canadian Nurses Foundation, which also like opened a lot of doors. And while working on this, I was working in a team which was very integrated between like cardiothoracic surgeons, registered nurses, and clinical epidemiologists on this clinical trial. And I felt that overall, this kind of research was very outcome driven. It wasn't so much based on theoretical hypotheses as what is going to actually happen. And it felt more holistic. A lot of the times, the findings we have in the lab, they don't translate the same way we expect it to when we go into human physiology or when we're looking at like a different larger population. And that brings me to COVID-19, which was a very, very dark time for us healthcare workers. And if you remember, at the very beginning, it was pre-vaccination period. Vaccines hadn't kind of been discovered yet. I was working frontline in long-term care, hospitals, assisted living. We were undergoing extreme PPE shortages. We were rationing it. We were doing extended use models. There was healthcare worker fatigue. There was a high risk of infection, transmission, and death for frontline workers. And our public health recommendations were rapidly evolving. I personally also like lost people in my family to COVID-19. So at that time, I took the decision that, okay, I have all of this experience in like the front line of what's exactly going on and how we need to kind of help in the fight against COVID-19. So why don't I kind of bring that in, tie it with my background in research and do some clinical work on that. So as I was applying, I took the opportunity to go back to my roots in immunology, update myself on the literature, publish a review, write a few COVID-19 grants. And then it led me to my first opportunity of working in a full-fledged COVID transdisciplinary research project at the National Research Council. So this project was under the Vice President's Office of Engineering, and it was basically on the COVID-19 task force on PPE decontamination technology. So what that means is when Canada was going through like a massive crisis of PPE for workers, for healthcare workers in particular, they were trying a lot of different avenues to try to like solve it, like increase supply, do this, find reuse models. So the project I was working on, I developed the protocol and design to kind of test whether or not existing technology in Canada, produced by Canadian industries, if they were able to adequately decontaminate PPE for reuse instantly in a hospital setting. So that was the very, very interesting project that I got to work on. And in this project, I was working with, again, another different field of specialists, which was very interesting. If you're like me and you get bored easily of one particular very niche subject after a while, working with interdisciplinary research teams is an excellent way to keep yourself learning new things. In this particular group, I was working primarily with engineers because it was under the engineering division. So there were chemical engineers, metrologists, physicists, there were microbiologists and immunologists, also industry partners. I got to interact with a lot of like hospital management, provincial health authorities. And my experiences of having both an understanding of decontamination immunology, as well as my frontline experiences of what kind of barriers we're going to get, what kind of pushback we might get when you suddenly start asking nurses to like, you're going to reuse the same mask over and over again, right? So all of that experience kind of came together into this role, and it was very interesting working with all of these different kind of experts. And then that brought me, at the end of that contract, I came to McGill University, and here I've been working on another COVID transdisciplinary project that's happening across like 10 different sites in Canada. And the project primarily focused on like dental schools, where we worked with people who are at an elevated risk of COVID transmission, because, if you're doing like oral surgery and things like that, there's obviously, you are like opening your mouth, and so there's a lot of risk of droplet infections that way. So the study examines infection rates, transmission risk, immunity with SARS-CoV-2. But also what's interesting is, since it is funded by the Canadian Immunity Task Force, we were looking at like post-vaccination immunity, how people are doing at the head of 6 months, at the head of a year from their vaccine. And because people in Canada, a lot of them got mixed vaccine regimens. Some people got AstraZeneca, some people got Pfizer, others got Pfizer, or Moderna. So like how the immunological implications are for this population as well. So for this particular project, I was again working with the various experts and from different disciplines, and in particular I was working with dentists, dental surgeons, dental residents, and then students and staff, and academics and clinical researchers like myself who had experience working with human subjects. In this particular project as well, my background in immunology was very helpful because we were handling and collecting biological samples from participants. So I needed to know kind of the infectious disease aspect of it, the infection prevention and control protocols, shipments, but I also needed to know how to manage like patient intake or participant intake, how to consent people, how to ensure ethics was being implemented, and things like that. So again, like very different set of skills and getting to learn so many different things from different experts. So finally, I'll just give you some tips about how, if you are interested in something like that, in working where different disciplines kind of like overlap and kind of working in that intersection, there's a lot of ways that I've seen people combine their basic science and clinical research interests. I've worked with a lot of MD PhDs or people who've done like one before the other. I've worked with RN PhDs and RN nurse practitioners. If you have a master's in basic sciences, you can always get a clinical research certification, or you can get a PhD, and then people have done clinical research fellowships. Some of them are very prestigious. So there's just a lot of different ways. You can even enter from basic science like a bachelor's degree, but like you will be limited in how far you can go without like a master's or a PhD or a professional health degree. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways in entering it if you're interested, if that's something you're passionate about. A lot of different kind of projects that you'll have your doors open to, not necessarily a lot of doors, but very interesting doors that it'll open up. So I'll just leave you with my candid career advice. I personally think that we as a generation like think a lot about compensation packages and job security and things like that. But in reality, if you want to do well, if you want to enjoy your work every day, find like your research passion and then do everything to chase that story. If you think that's a particular disease model, if you think that's a particular population who is underserved, you want to work for them or whatever that might be. And the academic programs we do, the fellowships we get, they're not like the end goal. They're just tools that we can use to then build your path towards your personal research destiny, whatever that might be. So yeah, that was a lot of talking. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope it's been interesting, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So yeah, does anyone have any questions? Again, feel free to walk up to the podium. It was so fascinating to hear how I didn't realize how interdisciplinary your role was.
Yeah, it's very unusual. I get the question, why? Why nursing? Why immunology? So yeah. Looks like it was a very good presentation, so there's no questions.
Yeah, I think you covered everything. There was a couple points I had questions, and then you covered it later on, and I'm like, oh, okay. It was very well done.
Right.
So yeah, I guess we can move on to our final speaker. So